Hey everybody, this is Sean from Low Code Approach. Before we hop in today's episode, I want to let you know that we are collecting everyone's thoughts on what topics we should cover for the upcoming season. To submit them, hopefully you're not driving. If you are, wait until you get somewhere safe, but go to aka.ms/low code topic request. That's all one word. aka.ms/low code topic request. From there, enter what topics you'd like us to cover in the upcoming season. And who knows, maybe we'll be able to get to them and get to the best people at Microsoft to talk to. Anyway, thanks for listening. We're excited to get your thoughts. Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Low Code Approach. I'm Sean Feeney, a Senior Product Marketing Manager on the Power Platform team. Now, normally, here's where I'd pass the mic over to Wendy, and Wendy would pass it over to Ken. But unfortunately, those two are at a barbecue cooking competition. Now, I don't know if they're cooking or they're judging the food themselves. If it's judging the food, my money's on Ken. If it's cooking the food, my money's on Ken. But we'll see what Wendy could bring to the table. I'll be super interested in this. However, in lieu of Ken and Wendy being here, I'm also joined by...
It is I, General Pinchel of Power Platform Security, Jocelyn, Senior Product Manager, and we have had a host of guests over the last years now, Sean. And oftentimes they seem to range primarily from the product side. But today, I'm very excited to bring in the guy who makes the money, who makes sure that everything that we in product are making actually gets sold. So today, joining us, we have Dave Milton, Director of Technical Specialist, aka GBB Manager. Dave, how are you? Who are you? What do you do?
Well, that's a lot of questions. And I may not have answers to all of those, but yeah. So I'm Dave. Yeah, I lead a team at Microsoft called the Power Platform Global Black Belt. So we work with the largest and most strategic customers across all industries to help them on their low code journey. And, a lot of what we do is not only just introducing like the ideas of low code, but also, working with the people who ultimately bring this to life. So, the developers who are going to end up creating solutions and having wonderful impact across the board. So it's a great place to be. Yeah, we live in the center of the universe at Microsoft. We sit between, engineering and our field, all of our customer success groups, PowerCat, like we work with all of these fantastic groups across Microsoft. So what that means is, yeah, I'm doing great. Today is Friday. So, +1 for that too.
That's awesome. Actually, Dave, you hit on a bunch of words to lead us into the topic that we want to get at. One of them is working with organizations and really the developers of those organizations to help bring, solutions to life and help them find success. And I think that's what we want to zero in on right now is back at Power Platform Community Conference, you did a fantastic presentation on developer pains or developer griefs when bringing in low code into an organization. And I wanted to start that conversation with like high level for those that weren't able to actually attend it. I know I wasn't able to attend it and Jocelyn wasn't able to attend it. Can you give us the high level overview before we dig into questions about that? What does that mean going forward for organizations?
Yeah, well, my background is actually software development. So I graduated with a degree in computer science. I was promised a long and successful career, like writing software. And actually, it largely started out that way. And I worked for a lot of interesting organizations, like special operations groups, a White House communications agency, like all these groups with like very high security and like high complexity type of requirements. And a couple of years into my career, I was told in no uncertain terms that like I would become a low code developer, external forces, right? Like bearing down on you and saying, hey, we're going to do it. And I would love to come in here and be like, oh, and I would just had a growth mindset. And I was like, yeah, let's do this and jump in. But no, it was like kicking and screaming and agony and pain. I mean, it was a good 6 to 8 months of resistance, like active resistance. And then out the other side, like my career was transformed. And I feel like, completely different trajectory for me. And years later, you start to maybe as I matured a little bit, like reflect back on like what actually happened to me during that piece. And, believe it or not, it very closely mirrors this idea of the stages of grief, which we apply to all sorts of life change, right? That might happen with someone where you go through shock, denial, frustration, depression, and then kind of at the other end, you start to like experiment and you ultimately integrate the change into your life. And hopefully, in my case, certainly things get better. And, that's what I see in a lot of developers that I talk to when we first introduce the idea of low code, because a lot of times at Microsoft, in these, again, big enterprise customers, we're talking to leadership, and they may make ultimately a decision that then gets, forced upon their IT staff to say, hey, we're going to go and do this. And so I'm passionate about it because I lived through it, and, certainly can empathize with what the change is, but completely understand, like, this is not a natural thing, right? That people are going to go through. And so I think, being able to share some of those stories, and that's what that session was really about, is, kind of personal reflection. I think it can be tremendously helpful to people kind of also in that same situation.
Before we get further into that session, I want to level set about the different types of developers that can nowadays leverage the Power Platform, right? Because you're telling me that you came up with an actual CS degree. Sean, did you have an actual No, me neither. My actual intention was to be a mechanical engineer. So I feel like he and I probably represent that other side of the demographic of low code users. Help me understand the spectrum.
This is one of the most exciting things. I think that draws everybody into this platform. And in fact, speaking of the conference where we present, if you go to one of these events, I have never seen the amount of energy, passion, like just, positivity that goes around it. And I think largely it's because so many people can now contribute to the creation of value with Power Platform. Because you're right, like, absolutely, I think professional developers, traditional developers have a lot that they can do on the platform. But ultimately, people who are close to problems, who are, I'd say, even like just somewhat technically inclined, can solve a ton of problems, like create a ton of value inside the organization. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that, there's just simply not enough software developers in the world to go solve the problems. Inside of an organization, there's also just not enough bandwidth, and, there's not going to ever be enough priority put on these projects to go and solve them. So absolutely, we look for, I'd say, like the traditional pro dev. We look for like the kind of technically inclined IT type developers. And on the other spectrum too, like the other side of the spectrum, absolutely, there are people who are business technologists who are, passionate about solving problems. They're close to the problems. They are subject matter experts in the problem. And what's crazy is when you get all those people working together, the rate of adoption and the likelihood for success of your software project, it skyrockets. And that's the thing, is, going back to the pro dev piece, like, I cannot tell you how many projects I worked on that by the time we actually got them out the door and in the hands of the users, they had no interest in using them anymore. Versus, when you work as a team together, right? And everybody has some emotional connection, they put their blood, sweat, and tears, they've contributed to the outcome. Those projects, extremely successful, right? Great rates of adoption, and overall better for the overall health of the business. So there's a ton of great goodness there, but everybody can contribute on the Power Platform.
So you bring up a really interesting point that I didn't think of before, where you're essentially, through the adoption of low code, you are in parallel also building that center of excellence, right? In that team and champions around, where before it used to be just this small nucleus of developers that would then build something and then hope that it all gets adopted by the organization at that point. Can you explain, was it that moment that also helped open up your eyes, or maybe expand your belief in the power of low code, to be like, oh man, like, now I have people behind me in different areas and they're like helping champion my work over here to build greater adoption and maybe like justify the work that I'm doing with my leadership? How did the center of excellence being created help further influence the adoption of low code?
Yeah, it shifts the model, because I think the traditional delivery model of an IT department is service provider, right? Not terribly strategic, if you ask me. Like, effectively, it's a utility. And as a developer, you're working in the factory, like the thing kind of gets put to you. And we always had the jokes about, oh, the developers in the cave just slide the pizza under the door. And like, but it, in a lot of ways, what they're talking about is not just like, oh, we love eating pizza and drinking Mountain Dew or whatever, but it's the physical separation from the actual people who are going to use the software. And in traditional and waterfall development, and like if you're outsourcing and you're bringing other teams in, like you just keep creating layers of separation from, the people actually creating the logic from the people who have to use it. And actually, there's this great saying, like you probably all heard it, like proximity breeds empathy. And that was something, as a developer, we really lacked, because you can't have empathy without the proximity, and you can't have the proximity when you create all these different layers. And so one of the things that maybe is I don't want to say it's an unintended consequence of these centers of excellence, but it certainly happens, like everyone gets brought closer together, right? And I've seen so many studies, I usually quote them in some of my sessions, where like there was a McKinsey study that talked about organizations that co-create and co-execute their digital strategy between IT and business are like 4 times more likely to be high performers. And you think about that, and like that study has nothing to do with low code, but it also has everything to do with low code, because you would require some type of technology that enables that co-execution. And those are all the things that start to happen now. So it brings developers and users closer together. And what's really great, and this also just hit home for me as a dev, is like, I don't actually have to build everything, right? Like if I could count like every notification someone wanted differently, or every type of, different screen or report they wanted, like in a lot of cases, now on Power Platform, I can build the foundation, I can build the core, but other people can contribute, right? In other layers on top of these solutions by building their own flows, by building their own agents, by building their own apps, even on top of those data sources. And like that's a layer of productivity that doesn't exist in traditional development. So, a lot of those things I think contribute to the overall higher adoption rates with this, but it's a core business outcome around the culture of the organization gets stronger inherently because we're bringing everyone closer together, right? So like empathy goes up, adoption rates go up, ultimately I want people who are passionate about solving problems to actually participate, in the creation of those solutions. Like you can't ask for better business outcomes. So that's why I think also we see all this excitement and all the adoption around Power Platform.
That is awesome. Like that is so fantastic to hear. And I think what's interesting too, right, is way back in the day, I used to be a SharePoint admin. I think all of us were secretly SharePoint admins at some point in our life. I don't think Jocelyn was alive when SharePoint came out anyway. Like the interesting part was like, as you're, deploying SharePoint, you're going through and you're getting people onboarded and kind of taking ownership of site collections and making sure that they understand permission levels. But there's this like shared pain that you go through when they understand your requirements as IT and you have to understand their requirements as the business process owner. And so I think there's that bonding experience, like you said, where we're like, we'll get through this together and we're going to build amazing solutions together. And with this combined knowledge, like we'll actually have something worthwhile that will get adopted through the organization. Now, that was low code. And as we're moving forward, we're bringing in agents. Agents are everywhere. I think I say it, and I think we're contractually obligated to say agents at least 6 times per episode. With that new technology coming in, how does that change the landscape for developers that maybe they were building out, and I don't want to get punched by my boss, but chatbots? And now they're bringing in agents. What does that look like for adoption and for developer grief? Maybe you're bringing in a new type of developer, like what Jocelyn said before.
Yeah, so with developers, I use this analogy. It comes from video games. I don't know if y'all play Fallout at all. Or
yeah.
Games where you build a character at the beginning of the screen. So like you start the game, first thing, okay, build your character, right? And they give you these attributes, of strength and endurance and luck and agility and all that stuff. But you don't have unlimited points. Right? Like you get your 21 points or whatever it is, and you've got to distribute it across these things. And I think back to like my developer career, and it was kind of the same thing. Like instead of, strength and endurance and good looks, which obviously is a 9, right? There were things like, are you front end? Are you back end? Are you, AI? Are you agents? Like what are you? Right. And this like notion of the full stack developer, I think, is a huge myth. But like the challenge comes in, like there's only so many points, right, that you can apply in traditional development. And one of the things I love is new things would come out. And all of a sudden as a dev, like either you got FOMO, like I got to catch up and go do this thing, or you're just asked to go do something new. And so like your productivity levels suffer while you try and learn every element of the stack. And agents is kind of that new thing where I talked to a lot of developers, like nobody has been doing agents for 20 years, right? Like that doesn't exist. That's not a thing. But that's really the great thing about Power Platform is like you can kind of be a 9 across the board when you're building on this giant platform with all of these developers from Microsoft and all this community, like basically bringing you 7, 8 layers up the stack. And so, with the introduction of agents, I would say, look, it's valuable to understand what agents can do and the foundations underneath. But if you use Copilot Studio, for instance, instead of trying to struggle through every layer in the stack and every choice that you might make in every layer in that stack, I can very quickly get to value. And I can start building agents that are incredibly, interactive and solve big problems, and I can do more of them. And so it's this idea that, developers really should, whether it's agents or something else, like challenge yourself to start at the top of the stack, with the highest layer of abstraction and fail your way down as necessary, right? Versus trying to start at the bottom and, build all of these layers, all of this plumbing, which ultimately is not going to impact the end users. It's not going to, It's not going to be visible to anyone else behind it. So I think that's the great challenge now is like Copilot Studio provides a lot of developers of all skill levels, the ability to come in and create tremendous impact right away, without having to stumble and I think maybe struggle through all of the different layers underneath.
Thank you, Dave, for making a appearance joke on a podcast where nobody can see where the 9 actually comes from, but I do appreciate
so they can't argue with me. Say that.
I love that. Jocelyn.
Sigh. JBs, they're my favorite. I wanted to ask you to help me as somebody who came up originally as a developer to dispel some myths, right? Because everything you're saying about how inclusive the low-code platform can be is something that I felt coming up, right? But on the other hand, I have more pro-code devy friends that almost looked at the Power Platform at first as tools for babies, you know what I mean? Like in a pejorative sense. So tell me, what are some thoughts or misconceptions that you may have had when originally starting to leverage a low-code platform as a developer, and how did your opinions change over time?
Yeah, and I will admit, again, you can't see me, so you can see how old I am. But like when I came into the low code world, I don't even think we called it Power Platform at the time, but there were a lot more limitations than there are today. Probably, Jocelyn. Yes. Thanks for mentioning that. But here's the thing: is at least in my experience, and I've seen other developers do this. One of the first things you do when you're approached with something like this is you immediately look for any limitation you can find, right? Because ultimately, what I think, if I psychoanalyze at least myself, it was all about control, right? Developers want full control over everything. Or you think you want it, right? And this is the maturing part that happened to me is I thought I wanted full control, because the more control that you take in a solution you build, ultimately the more responsibility you take on as well. It's a linear progression, right? If I control every aspect of the stack, if something breaks in any part of that stack, it's me, right? I get the call. I've got to fix it. I'm actually the one building the technical debt. Okay. Now, when we think about like, hey, developers, so what they're going to do is they're going to look for those restrictions because they're in search of full control. So the first thing I asked them is like, do you really want full control? Is that really a sustainable and a scalable way to build? Because the area in my career where I started to really hate my job is when I had to answer for all the terrible decisions I had made over the past few years, building every layer of that stack, taking full control of everything, right? So the first thing was, okay, I ultimately don't want full control, right? What I really want is the end result to be amazing and to have the impact. So then the second piece is, you're going to go find those limitations and you think of them as limitations. And look, the reality is every platform has limitations. Power Platform has fewer of them than they had 5 years ago, but they still exist. But here's the interesting thing, right, is that they would look at the limitations as like, okay, that's a reason why I can't use this. I found a limitation, therefore I'm going to backwards track from that and find a reason why I might, need to get around that limitation and say I can't use it. But I always started to look at it as more of like, look, what a platform gives you, yes, there's limitations, but that limitation actually creates structure, right? So there's a structure to what you can and can't do. And one of the most interesting quotes I'd ever heard was something about like structure frees creativity, which really hits home to me. Because if you think about it, you guys, well, Jocelyn, you're probably too young for this, but Sean, you ever seen Whose Line Is It Anyway? Like where, it's an improv show and these great comics get on stage and they don't just like start being funny. They get some structure, right? Give me a location, give me a place, give me a situation, whatever it is. And then they kind of use that structure and they build off of it and they gain leverage from it. And they, do this wonderful act based on it. And they start all over again. And so I look at platforms this way. It's like, look, they are structure. Yes, I'm giving up some control in the sense that there are limitations that I'm going to have. I'm giving up some responsibility though. And as a result of that, what I end up doing is I'm kind of moving a little bit away from just pure coding everything and more about composing. And when I do that, I achieve a much higher level of impact because I can build more things. And yes, the structure and the limitations are there. But in Power Platform, for instance, we've done a fantastic job of giving every developer an escape hatch. Wherever there's a limit, you can, fail back to Azure. You can add some of those, raw materials and tools where you need them, but you get to dial in a lot more control around, hey, how much do I want to take on, right? Because over time, and we've seen this, there's going to be huge changes in the IT landscape. And if I'm saddled and burdened with like years and decades of technical debt, I'm not going to be as agile. So there's a lot of things to that answer, right, with pro devs, but I think it does come down to, look, really examine the amount of control and responsibility you need. And can you look at a platform as a structure and not a set of limitations? And can you use all of that to ultimately scale?
You bring up a really good point. One, I love the yes and aspect of both Whose Line and then also of Power with the extensibility components of that, right? Like, you bring up a good point. So, like, you have this great foundation of Power Platform where you can build solutions out. But like you said, if you do run into a block, not a blocker, for example, but a limitation, you're able then to go and bring back those development chops and actually start building stuff out. One thing I did want to talk about, and you touched on a little bit before, was ownership. Right. And so, like, Dave, you build out these amazing solutions with pro code, right? And I don't know about you, but like back when I was doing MERN stack development stuff, and I know people are probably throwing things at their radio or at their, whatever listening device they have right now.
A radio, Sean?
Yeah.
I didn't think you were on the radio. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
You guys will hear. Bluetooth is the thing. Thank you. Anyway, so what I want to say, though, is I don't know how well you added comments into your code, Dave, but when you had to pass ownership of that solution onto somebody else and like move on to the next thing, how painful was it to then go back and explain to whoever the new dev was, God forbid they were a junior or somebody like that, coming in and taking ownership, and then you had to go and be like, why did I write it that way? Why did I do what I did before?
Shots fired. I can't believe you're bringing up my code commenting. I mean, look, it was terrible. I don't think I've never met a dev who's been like, I'm a wonderful corporate citizen when it comes to commenting code. But I mean, the reality is, not only do we not comment, you just make bad decisions.
Yeah.
And it's not because you're a bad developer. It's just like you don't always have all the information, right? Because again, like it goes back to those layers of separation between you and the problem that you're trying to solve and the people who are going to be using this stuff. And like, there's a lot of bureaucracy, but in that process inherently built in, right? But absolutely, like that was always an issue around maintainability. And then I'd say the other piece is just the decisions aren't always in the code that you wrote and like the logic that you implemented in the language that you've written, but in the frameworks that you chose, right? Because it's never just like choose a language and get going. Like, okay, well, what's the infrastructure stack look like? What's the data stack look like? What's the middleware layer look like? Okay, now we choose the front end, and now we're writing some code. And the challenge is like all of those incur like decisions where we wanted full control. And now, and like, I can't count the number of times. Yeah, maybe someone didn't comment something, but also maybe somebody used a weird version of this framework in the middle of the stack. And now we are stuck because there's some bug and they don't support it anymore. And no one was tracking this. And now it's like a complete disaster. So I'd say like, don't limit yourself to like the poor decisions I made to not comment my code. I made plenty of other poor decisions about like the different layers and things that go in the stack that, aged like milk, 5 years later. And now we got to come back and fix it. And that was the other part too. Like when I looked at like what actually brought me joy in this job, ultimately wasn't any of that stuff. It wasn't in choosing a framework or a data layer. It wasn't in choosing the language. It wasn't even actually the act of writing code. The big payoff was in the reveal, right? And the impact it had on the organization and the people who would stop in the hallway and be like, oh man, that was killer. Like, I love that app. Like, that's the serotonin boost you want as the dev to see that this stuff is used. And I chuckled because I saw there was a slide, I think it was from the GitHub Copilot team, and their product is fantastic, but they had a stat that said something like, developers using it, 75% of them felt more focused on satisfying work, right? Because of GitHub Copilot. And I look at that stat and be like, hey, it's a fantastic endorsement of their product. It also means that devs don't ultimately feel satisfied by writing code. Like if they're more satisfied having the agent write the code for them, then I'd argue like, okay, well, maybe we've started to misplace a little bit of like, what's fun about this job? So, all that to say, I didn't comment my code. Thank you for airing my dirty laundry. And, but there's plenty of other reasons too, that you might look at this, and think that, I'm gaining a lot. And those are the things that ultimately don't bring me a lot of joy anyway. Right. So like, why should I be so resistant?
So we've started to allude to a little bit of ALM there, but this wouldn't be this podcast without me and Ken asking something along the lines of management. So I don't know what has happened before I was alive. I don't know if perhaps you were an admin at some point in time, Dave. But what I'd like to know is, how did you feel like perhaps the admins may have treated you differently or empowered you with more or less or different controls as a pro dev versus as a low code dev?
Yeah. Well, we certainly got a lot more leeway, right? As pro devs, you are inherently more trusted, I think, in the organization. Now, things have changed a little bit in the 20 some years since I was doing that full time. But what I would say is Yes, we generally had more access to back-end systems. We were more trusted to use, sensitive data to incorporate our own security models. Still had to go through reviews, but a lot of the trust was based on the fact that we had a process in place, and code reviews would happen, peer reviews would happen. You'd have your red teams hitting the software. So there was plenty of structure in there to mitigate against things that maybe, wouldn't normally exist in the citizen dev world. And so we've had that. And the funny thing is, I've actually transitioned now, here at Microsoft, my job actually is in software development, but believe it or not, I'm a pretty prolific Power Platform developer here at Microsoft, and things that the Global Black Belt organization has to use. And it's been wonderful, actually, citizen dev, to be able to use things like pipelines, and just have that kind of managed for me, and be able to connect, directly to Git and have my source code. Yeah, hey, it's managed. I've got a small team of folks who contribute to these projects. I can deploy to pipelines, and I know that, the admins at Microsoft are like, hey, you're covered, you're good. And in fact, that allows me to actually get environments in higher levels with, more connectors than maybe you would have in the standard ones. It's because we're able to do this process, but I don't have to spend a lot of my time doing it. Again, my job is talking to customers, right? Not building software anymore. So I don't have time or energy for all those things, but it's basically taken all of that off my plate. All that cognitive load, all the things that we'd have to do all the time can now be spent on what my job actually is. And for the IT admins, they don't have to worry. They have full transparency into what I'm doing. And in fact, I have to go reattest, every 60 days on my environments and what we're using. I actually am required to have good app descriptions, which fortunately are started for me with AI. And I get my head start there, with all that coming through pipelines. So, I think everybody wins in this game. What I find is I saw the admin relationship as adversarial in the past, right? Anytime they came into my life, it was for something I did wrong. It's it's like the police coming in to tell me that, hey, this is not, what you should be doing. But now it's a lot more collaborative, right? They're enabling me. They're basically shepherding innovation, right? By giving me the tools to capture market share for me instead of me using Excel or something else, right? And I think that's the other key thing that's shifted is admin and governance has gone from people saying no to people saying yes under these conditions, and yes with these tools, and yes with this, with this set of capabilities.
If I were to harness my inner Brother Ken, or perhaps even my inner Captain Uncle Zohar right now, I would say that you are alluding to the fact of we could have such rich environment strategy in the low code Power Platform, right? Where we can understand that there's these red, yellow, green zones, and where perhaps the work that you're doing could fit in. And as you're saying, with all of the right ALM tools, we can migrate those things to different zones depending on as the application is developing. But at the same time, we don't want to limit people. I actually was in a session that Charles, our CVP, was presenting yesterday, where he was saying something along the lines of, we would never tell somebody, you've made enough Word documents. That's too many Word documents for you. You need to chill on those number of Word documents. And we want to make sure that we don't do this. We do the same thing with Power Platform, where you can make as many applications and resources and agents and flows as you need, as long as it's managed in the most secure, most governable way. And that's why we have all of these capabilities like routing to help you make all of your Word documents or apps or flows or agents where you need them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've built the tools for scale. Right. And that's ultimately what you need. And without the tools and without the structure, there is no scale. And that's what I see over and over again with customers. Yeah, we always show a slide that has 3 zones, red, yellow, green. And the reality is you may have 5, you may have 7, but what you ultimately have is a structure to scale. And that's what I think, the key point that I always tell customers, that is ultimately what we're giving you with Power Platform. It's not just a set of low code tools. It's not just a way to build agents. It's not just a way to build apps. This is the way you scale your business, right? And part of it is because, more people are going to be able to contribute to the creation of value. All of those people plus the pro devs are going to be able to go faster. We're able to focus more heavily on the actual pointy end of the stick, the business problem at hand versus all of the plumbing and all of the commodity stuff underneath it, right? But those are the elements that scale. And that's what I think every business is trying to do today is they're trying to scale not just, 10%. They want to scale, 10x.
Yeah.
And so that's how we need to look at this. That's how developers need to look at it, right? How do I scale my impact to the organization, right? People who are subject matter experts need to say, how am I going to scale my knowledge beyond just my personal interactions? That's what Power Platform does for you. Admins need to say, how can I scale the amount of capability that I can control and govern. That's from, our managed capabilities in the platform. So like all of this, ultimately, it's one word. It's all about scale. That's what we're giving customers. That's what they're ultimately buying from us. And that's the outcome they should all be looking for.
I love that. Hey, Dave, as we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, are there any tips that you can provide, or even if there's links that we drop in show notes for listeners to help them understand or help them get over the grief and the pain that developers may be facing as they move over to low code, or even if they're shifting over to Power Platform, Microsoft Copilot Studio, in bringing in agents in there? Any tips that you could provide, please?
I'll just say, from a practical experience, no developer has ever been convinced from a narrative. So, if you're listening to me, you're a developer, I don't expect you to just be like, oh, okay, yeah, Dave makes great points, I'll just go ahead and do it. Now, seeing is believing, for a lot of developers. And what I would say is, like, in those stages of grief, the part where you kind of come out of frustration and depression is where you actually start to experiment. And that's the key in the call to action I have for every dev is, look, we got great labs out there on GitHub. In fact, we did a great pro dev lab at the Power Platform Conference. I'm sure we'll have another version of it, coming up soon. But it takes you through, I think Scott Duro and team did a wonderful job taking you across the platform. So I'd say, watch Scott Duro's content on the Power Platform channel. Check out those labs, get hands-on. And then the third thing, which is not technology, at all, is just, really start to look at, like, how are you feeling? Like, is the amount of control that you take on these projects really worth the amount of responsibility you're taking on? And like, think about what are the parts that you value, not just in your job, but like, how does your organization value yourself, right? And figure out, like, look, what are the organization's strategic objectives? And then what I'm doing as a software developer actually contributing materially to those strategic objectives? What if I could do 10 times more? Right. And if those sorts of things are lining up with what your organization wants to achieve, I think you'll find that, not only is Power Platform a lot of fun, it's really rewarding, but it's ultimately going to give you scale, right? And scale is what you should be looking for in your career. So that's my call to action too. Check that out. But there's tons of other good resources too, and we can provide some of those in the links as well.
Dave, thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge, for sharing the stages of grief you went through and helping our audience try to find success too, just like you. I think I found out some description terms I'm going to add in here, and we'll talk about it after we wrap. But this was awesome. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.